Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our panel called Dying for a Home, where we'll be talking about housing and gentrification. My name is Marika Diaz. I use gender pronouns she and her, and I'm a tenant attorney and also the director of the Safety Net Project at the Urban Justice Centre. I'm thrilled to be here with all of you and very grateful to the organisers of this conference for inviting me to be involved. This morning, we're in for a real treat, I think, because we have some amazing panelists. All of whom are working in New York City, doing different work that relates to housing and gentrification and displacement. I myself work providing a lot of support for tenant movements, particularly on the legal side, and working with folks who are fighting back against homelessness, against displacement. I'm speaking to you from the South Bronx, land of the Lenape people, and I'm now going to open it up for our other panelists to introduce themselves. And I think I'll start by handing it over to Rob Robinson. Good morning, Rob.
Good morning, Marika. Thank you. Thank you to the Community Service Society, and in particular, because I do a lot of events planning, I want to say a special thank you to all the staff at the Community Service Society for the support in helping us get this off the ground. My name is Rob Robinson. I am a community organizer and activist based here in New York City, but fortunate enough to work with housing organizations across the country and around the world. I work with social movements clean across the globe on those issues, as Marika outlined, on land, housing, gentrification, displacement. But, based on this conference, I think what also runs parallel to the work that I do is understanding the needs of people. So lately, focus has shifted somewhat to include water, food in those conversations and part of my organizing. So thank you. And hopefully this will be a dialogue between us, and you will have some interesting questions for us as panelists. Thank you.
Thanks, Rob. It's great to have you here today with us. And I'll now hand it over to Kazembe, who will introduce himself. Hey, Kazembe. Well, Kazembe, I think you're muted. Oh.
Hello, good morning, everybody. My name is, good morning. Good to be here. Thank you, Marika. Thank you, Rob. Good morning to the conference. My name is Kazembe Balagun. I'm a writer and activist who lives in the North Bronx. My work primarily focuses on cultural production and the right to the city, as well as the continued fight for Black lives in the 21st century. I'm really excited to be part of this panel because housing is a linchpin to all of our struggles, and I think it represents a movement of movements. And I look forward to a dialogue today.
Great, thank you, Kaz. And then finally, we have Sandra Contreras with us. Sandra, are you there?
Yes.
Good morning.
Thank you, Marika, and thank you to my fellow panelists. And I have to, of course, like Rob said, we really want to thank the Community Service Society for everything they do for the tenant movement, as well as many other, equity issues. Thank you so much for having me at this conference. I'm the lead tenant organizer at a community-based legal service and tenant organizing organization in Uptown Manhattan. We work primarily in the Upper West Side and Harlem, I would say, Central Harlem. And I come to you as a social worker as well. Got into the housing movement through my education in social work and seeing, as Kazembe said, that housing really is the linchpin of struggles, not just for racial equity, but for class equity all around the country. And of course, in the most obvious ways, our cities are really affected by housing crises. I guess I'll leave it at that. look forward to our conversation.
Thanks, Sandra. So I think, for our panel today, I'm going to get us started and just sort of, I guess, contextualize our conversation with a bit of history and, struggles over land and housing, and also kind of perhaps give some information about some of the campaigns and struggles that are going on, right now as we speak. And then I'll hand it over to each of our panelists to have an opportunity to, speak about the things that they're going to address, and then there will be a chance at the end for us to address sort of, comments and questions from the audience. And so I definitely encourage and invite you all to put your comments and your questions in the comments box in the chat, so that we can get to those once we've heard from our panelists. And we definitely want to hear from you all, and we know that a lot of you all will have been involved in different struggles yourself and have obviously your own experiences of the impacts of gentrification. And so we want to hear from you. So, to get us started by, providing a little sort of a historical context, shall we say, I think you all know that our history is really one of struggles over land and access to land for basic needs, like Rob was saying, things like food and water and housing. And here in the US, and not just here in the US, but very acutely here in the US, it's an entirely racialized and racist history, from the violent dispossession of the land from the indigenous peoples who had long cultivated and taken care of it, to the enslavement of African peoples to work the land for the enrichment of an already very wealthy white minority. From later on, the deliberate use of legal devices like zoning and restrictive covenants to deny people of colour access to housing and land and home ownership, to, affirmative action programs that were intended to enable only white home ownership, and were combined with with cultural and political programs that cultivated a very particular idea of the American dream, which was a dream really rooted in white-only home ownership in white-only suburbs, and based on white flight from urban centres. Things like urban renewal, which nationally displaced over 1 million people across 2,500 neighbourhoods, and redlining that, intentionally orchestrated the exclusion of Black and Brown people from home ownership and ensured, the ongoing disinvestment in neighbourhoods of colour. Both of these things, urban renewal and redlining, were, the less talked about, uglier side of the widely lauded New Deal. Our public housing, also emanating from the New Deal, and similarly with an entirely segregated history. Public housing that over the decades, we have seen increasingly become housing for working class people of colour, and not coincidentally, simultaneously increasingly neglected, criminalized, demonized, and eventually turned over to new forms of urban renewal, like the Hope 6 demolition program that displaced so many public housing tenants in Chicago, and then now today, privatization through programs like the RAD program and others that you may have heard of. We've seen decades of disinvestment and willful destruction of neighbourhoods of colour, and perhaps one of the most prominent examples of that is the literal burning of the South Bronx. And then with the rise of neoliberalism and the active cultivation of the rise of real estate capital as a driving economic force, we see our cycles of gentrification begin. And so all of those years of disinvestment and neglect start to pay off. And for real estate capital, they start to pay off, and those super distressed and depressed property values suddenly become opportunities to cash in big. And so starting in the 80s and the 90s and ongoing to today, we see a reversal of white flight and a return of the white professional classes to urban centres. Simultaneously, we also saw the financialization of real estate, right? And we're seeing that now, still. The rise of the corporate landlords, including multinational corporations, just simply buying up our cities. Black and brown neighborhoods across our city have experienced really a disturbing array of predatory equity landlords with over-leveraged loans, whose business plans very overtly, include mass evictions, buyouts of tenants, including buyouts of tenants enabled by the banks and required by the banks who finance them, tenant surveillance and harassment, dangerous and illegal construction, and really a systematic, willful failure to make any repairs or to spend any money on the buildings that they have come to acquire. And then after them, what, black and brown neighborhoods have seen are the vulture buyers, right? The smaller corporations that come in and in a sort of metaphoric sense, pick off the carcasses of what these big multinational predatory equity companies have left behind, to extract what little more they can extract by way of profit. All of this at the expense of the tenants who live in these buildings. And so, while the more visible face of gentrification for a lot of us, is sort of students and fancy cafes and yoga and doggy daycare, really those things are just the sort of the small tip of what is really actually a humongous corporate and political iceberg. And that iceberg is really executing a corporate takeover of our neighborhoods and our cities. But, of course, when we talk about the history of land, it's also a history of movements and resistance and class struggle, whether that's from the struggles against violent colonization of Indigenous peoples worldwide, which continue to this day, to more locally, New York tenant farmers before the 20th century fighting back against exploitative manorial landlords, from the immigrant women of the Lower East Side doing some of New York City's first recorded rent strikes, which happened in the early 1900s in 1904, where they were striking against the rent being too damn high. To the rent strikes in 1975, when tenants in Co-op City, 15,000 tenants at that, which was about 90% of the folks living in the buildings, they were on strike for 13 months and they withheld $25 million. And in between those two, were many, many massive and successful rent strikes, particularly in Harlem and in the Bronx, all or most of which I'm sure, nobody taught you about in school and people rarely hear about. But that is a very strong part of the history of the housing movement. There were also struggles and campaigns against urban renewal, so-called slum clearance, and in New York City against, the master builder, Robert Moses. There's organizer Jesse Gray and Harlem tenants fighting back against just simply deplorable housing conditions and the discriminatory higher rents that were paid by Black tenants. To going to Chicago, where the Contract Buyers League was fighting back against predatory deed sales that robbed them of their money and their homes, and also fighting back against the racist blockbusting, which was used to enable those transactions. To the Black Panthers and the Young Lords and Chinatown's Iwo Quinn, who are all taking on terrible housing conditions and the impact of that on community health. And then later in the 80s, sweat equity and tenant takeovers that were coordinated to combat disinvestment and abandonment by landlords. And, building on top of that history, the housing movement, as many of you all will know, is again rising. Many of you will be familiar with the wins of recent years. When everyone told New York City tenants that it was totally impossible, they waged a campaign and won a right to counsel for tenants in eviction cases. And they fought that campaign and won that campaign, not because they, thought that lawyers were going to be the solution to gentrification, but rather to counteract the very, acute weaponization of housing court by landlords as a tool of gentrification, and recognizing that, we need to not be evicted. We need to be able to fight to stay, and we need to win that fight so that we can fight for all the other things we need. Whether that's affordable housing, healthcare, fighting back against policing, violent policing and racist policing, and all of the other things that communities are fighting around. And that win paved the way for right to counsel wins in cities across the country, and is also something that folks look to internationally as well. Last year we had the amazing victory in Albany of the Housing Safety and Tenant Protection Act, led by Housing Justice for All Coalition and the Upstate and Downstate Coalition. And that really reversed what had been decades of neoliberal erosion of our tenant rent laws and protections by Albany politicians who had, and still are, in the pockets of real estate interests. And so that was really an amazing win, and something that the tenant movement now is building on. Other things to mention are, lots of anti-harassment protections that tenants have won, laws against illegal construction, a lot of different campaigns that have been waged in recent years, and successfully so. And now, while the COVID pandemic rages and the fight continues, and the stakes, of course, are so high right now, given the impact of displacement, what it means to become homeless during a global pandemic. And so we have seen over the last 6 to 7 months, a lot of new campaigns and movements emerging. And we actually have some photos to share of actions that have taken place during the last 6 months, and I believe some of our tech folks are gonna put that up on the screen now, while I'm talking. And so the photos that you're about to see are, this particular picture was taken by the New York State Nurses Association. And then the remaining pics are really from Rob Robinson, who's on our panel today, and me from different actions that we've been at. And so some of the campaigns that you might not be aware of that are very strongly being fought right now are, firstly, to cancel rent, and a campaign for a political solution to the massive crisis that is taking place as a result of the COVID pandemic. And to further that campaign, we currently right now have approximately 1,000 tenants on a coordinated rent strike in New York City, an organized coordinated rent strike across the city, striking to push for that political solution of rent cancellation, which is what tenants know they need to avoid mass displacement. Right now we have over 1 million tenants across New York State who've not been able to pay rent because of the economic impacts and devastation of COVID. And that is not something that individual tenants should be grappling with in eviction cases. Politicians need to step up and act for the greater social good and for tenants. We've also got campaigns around an eviction moratorium, and campaigns to keep the housing court eviction mills closed, which tenants were successful in doing for quite some months throughout the pandemic. And it's only more recently that the courts are now running again, despite very fierce opposition. We have eviction defense networks, folks who are organizing in neighborhoods and across the state, ready to do blockades, to actually physically prevent evictions, to physically prevent things from moving forwards in the courts. We've seen a very prominent and important campaign, the Homeless Can't Stay Home campaign, which is really a fight to ensure the safety of what are 80,000 homeless folks in New York City during a pandemic where so many are both either in the streets, because that's actually the safer option, or in our very dangerous congregate shelters where people are compelled to circulate and to sleep within feet of each other in a way that doesn't allow for any social distancing whatsoever. There's also the fights against warehousing of housing. And, we all know that we actually have plenty of housing for all of the homeless folks in our city and in our country. And actually, what we have is a problem of unused housing and hoarding of homes by landlords intentionally. And then there's also fights for proactive solutions like community land trusts and like community opportunity and tenant opportunity to purchase legislation, which would actually allow communities and tenants to take over the buildings that they live in. And, we've seen some very inspiring, I would say, actions this year. After, many of you will recall at the beginning of the year, after a very violent eviction, honestly, from a vacant house that they had restored and were living in, Oakland's Moms for Housing secured eventually a transfer of the house off the speculative market and into a community land trust. Folks will remember that during the summer, protesters in Minneapolis took possession of a whole hotel so that it could actually safely shelter over 200 homeless people. And then more recently, we saw a successful organized takeover by homeless mothers and children of 50 vacant government-owned houses in Philadelphia. And that ultimately won a transfer of those houses into a community land trust so that those families could continue living there in permanently affordable housing. And so I think it is fair to say that the housing movement, the tenant movement is rising, and is really ready to fight, and is fighting every day. And so, on that note, I think maybe what I'll do now is hand it over to our first panelist, Kazembe. Are you there, Kazembe? Yes, wonderful.
Good morning. Hello, everyone. Hello. Hi. Could you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Kaz.
Okay, wonderful. So I just jump into it?
Yes, please do.
Okay, I'll just jump into it. Yeah, good morning, everybody. Thank you. Once again, it's wonderful to be here. Thanks again to the Community Service Society of New York, and thank you, Marika and Rob and Sandra and all of you who are out there. I guess the first thing I would say is that I want to thank Marika for a wonderful recap of the housing struggles that have happened going forward in this time. And I think that, before I begin my comments, I do want to mention one person who unfortunately is no longer with us, and that person's name is Cecil Corbin Mark, who is the deputy director of WEAC, West Harlem Environmental Action, who passed away last week. Cecil was policy director. He was also a cultural figure and a staunch defender of Harlem, and certainly somebody who I always relied on for wisdom and guidance in my work. and I just want to honor him by this pointing out that what a wonderful legacy he's led, and I'm deeply sad by his passing. Um, and I say that to say is that part of the reason that part of the part of the presentation I'm giving today is on James Baldwin and the right to the city. And part of the reason I'm giving this, remarks on James Baldwin is because I'm a child of Harlem. I was born in Harlem. My parents were Southern migrants from Charleston, South Carolina, who came up to New York in 1960. They first lived in the South Bronx, and then they moved into public housing in the Polo Grounds housing projects on 155th Street and 8th Avenue, where they raised me. I'm the youngest of three children. Um, and and certainly growing up in Harlem during the 70s, 80s, and 90s, Harlem was still a southern community. It was still a small community. It was still a small village that I was looked after and felt safe. And when I looked at the title of this is called "Dying for Home." I think a lot about this issue around what safety looks like in the midst of a pandemic, and what does home look like in the midst of a pandemic. And I guess this is where I think some of the thinking of like the writer and philosopher and thinker James Baldwin comes in, because certainly James Baldwin's work has kind of come back into vogue. It's never gone out of vogue. All of his written material is still very much in print. But when we were conceiving of this panel, it was during the height of the Minnesota rebellions and the rebellions that happened after the murder or the police murder of George Floyd. And suddenly the quotes and the paragraphs and the images of Baldwin started to pop up again, um, mostly related to his 1964 essay, The Fire Next Time. Um, but I think it's really important not only to place Baldwin in the context of that particular essay, which chronicled uh, the causes of the long hot summer of 1964, which showed rebellions in Harlem, and later a year later rebellions in Watts, and sometimes later rebellions in Newark. But I think it's also important to also think about Baldwin's work as an urbanist. He was someone who was raised in New York City. He was somebody who was born in Harlem. He was somebody who went to a public school. He graduated from DeWitt Clinton High School in the Bronx. And he was really what I call, in our sense, an organic intellectual. He was a product of the New York public school system, but also the New York Public Library. And also at that time, a free and independent city university of New York. And so his intellectual life was one that was one of a decommodified intellectual life that was certainly broadly engaged. And as such, while he's known for much of his fictional writings and some of his fiery essays, he can be placed also as somebody who was like writing intensely about the city. Essays like Fifth Avenue Uptown, a report from occupied territory, much of the fire next time, all deal with the issue of Black life in the city and what does it mean to live in the city particularly as a Black person, which was kind of focuses on, and I think it also focuses on a couple of things. Um, and one more thing that I want to point out too is that I think Baldwin's ultimate ideas around writing around the city also speaks to a large legacy of the relationship of arts in the city. And I'm so happy this conference is focusing on full participation, not only of activists but also as artists. I certainly put them in the same category as people like Richard Wright, um, Langston Hughes, Leroy Jones, and Hedda Jones. Now known as Mary Baraka. All these people not only wrote about the city, but also created cities, created makings of cities, which I think is very important. In fact, there's a funny thing that happened. If you look at, if you go down to the Lower East Side, you see across the street from the NYU building in Cooper Square, a small tenement with a clothing line on top of it, and that's Hedda Jones's apartment. And that clothing line still represents a kind of like communal feel of Jewish life in New York City. And I think that that's something that's also important in terms of full participation, because what we're talking about in terms of full participation is also connected to what kind of city we want to live in. And what made cities attractive in the first place were not cities that are quote unquote creative, but cities that, were able to bring together, the communal life of many different communities. Puerto Rican communal life, Black communal life, Jewish communal life. That's what made cities attractive in the first place. But in thinking about some of the work of Baldwin, I want to kind of bring up kind of 3 points, and I think this is something that Marika kind of intersected in some of her comments before, which is this kind of connection between housing, labor, and the police. And I think that and so in the time that Baldwin's writing in the 1950s and 1960s, some of these essays coming up, there's a whole time movement of what was called urban renewal, but what James Baldwin called Negro removal, right? This is when wrecking balls and bulldozers plowed down mostly Black and brown neighborhoods throughout the city and transformed the landscape of the city. And something that's I think is really important to note is that this is also part of like, the unwieldiness of capital, right? That what we're experiencing at times is the unwieldiness of capital. So Tom and Gotti, who's an urban planner, likes to say a lot of times, well, New York, there is no plan of New York City. There's no executive plan of New York City. So whatever happens in New York City is a result of whoever's desires of capital is. And because there's no plan of New York City, this also means that activists have to be very reticent and ready to think about and deal with the legal manifestations of things that allow people to do harm in our communities. And I'm also reminded of the quote by Robert Moses, who once said, laws can be changed, but once you build a building, it's hard to change. It's hard to change a building, right? And so much of what Baldwin's thinking about in terms of this period that he's thinking about in terms of some of his writing and thinking is thinking about what those buildings mean and what does it mean for particularly in Black communities, and particularly in this Harlem. So a clear example of this is when he was writing in the essay Fifth Avenue Uptown. This was the issuance of the beginning of the construction of public housing projects. And as Marika kind of pointed out, the housing projects were, there's nothing indicatively wrong with housing projects. There's nothing indicatively wrong with vertical housing. But what's wrong with what I think with the issue that many housing activists and Baldwin points out was that this housing was grown and created in the midst of widening racial discrimination and widening wealth gaps that have existed. And I would like to kind of read just a little bit of the essay from Baldwin from Fifth Avenue Uptown. The projects in Harlem are hated. They're hated as much as the policemen, and they're saying a great deal. They're hated for the same reason. Both reveal unbearably the real attitude of the white world. No matter how many liberal speeches are made, no how many lofty editorials are written, no matter how many civil rights commissions are set up. The projects are hideous, of course. There'll be in a law, apparently, respected throughout the world, that popular housing shall be as cheerless as a prison. They're lumped all over Harlem, colorless, bleak, high, and revolting. The wide windows look out at Harlem's invincible and indescribable squalor. The Park Avenue railroad tracks, among which, about 40 years ago, the present dark community began. The unrehabilitated homes bowed down, it seemed, under the great weight of frustration and the bitterness they contained. The dark, ominous schoolhouses from which the children may emerge, maimed, blind, hooked, or enraged for life. and the churches are putting blocks of churches, the walls like cannons and the walls of a fortress. And even if the administration of the project were not so insanely humiliating, for example, one must report raises in salary to management, which will eat up the profit by raising one's rent. The management has the right to know who is staying in your home. The management can ask you to leave at the discretion. The projects will still be hated because they're an insult to the meanest of intelligence. And I think that right there is like, you see a taste of Baldwin's scathingness in terms of talking about the issues around housing. Again, it's not an issue around what housing is being built, but how the housing is being built and and what's the administrative function of housing. Um, and I think that for myself, as someone who's a native Harlemite, um, I'm in a position now where I defend the existence of the housing projects. I think that we have a responsibility to understand and to strengthen and to pour money into and resources into housing projects. But just that statement that Bowen makes, right? That these things were built out of spite of the white world towards the black world. And if I were to translate that today, I would say the same thing is the same thing can be said about office towers or high-rise luxury condos in the South Bronx or in Harlem or in Brownsville, or high-rise luxury apartments in any neighborhood. They exist as a means of insulting and bowing and getting us to bow down to who runs the city, whose administrative capacity of the city. And I think that part of the activist tradition that Marika so talked about, and so the questions that Marika kind of laid out and some of the great photos and things that Rob kind of laid out is that we have agency to challenge this, right? And so the way in which Baldwin challenges this in his writings, his words, is also indicative of the way that activists have challenged this as well. And I think that one thing for us to really think about is that um, I think Baldwin's spirit is one of like not letting people off the hook. Um, I think that there's a tendency to like particularly in this kind of polarized electoral season or space that we're in right now, to just kind of look at the other and say like, well, that's a problem over there. That's a problem of poverty over there. But Baldwin, in the midst of the civil rights movement, is writing from the North. He's writing from the city, and he's saying that there's an issue right here in our cities right now, and I'm not going to allow you to be off the hook. So you can't just point a finger at somebody else. You need to look at your own self. And I think that activists today, like many artists, are doing that. In the protests that we see, the protests that we see are but a mirror of society, and it shows up to society that this is us. This is the issue that we need to fight for. And I think that this is something where it's also an issue not only of this, but also of 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 also global concern as well. And what I end with is that ultimately, as many of you know, James Baldwin leaves New York and goes to Paris. And in Paris, one of the things he realizes is that he's carrying America with him. And that insofar as that everything he's had to deal with is also in France, and he has to confront it. And I can talk about it a little bit later, but his relationship with the Algerians and his relationship with other black people in Paris speaks to this. And one thing that I'm always reminded of is the fact that the one of the more important incidences of his life is that when he's staying at a single room occupancy hotel in Paris, he leaves that hotel and he takes with him some towels and some sheets, and he's later arrested for petty larceny, and he has to spend a week in the jails of Paris. And I think you can draw a direct line between Baldwin spending time in jail in Paris for a minor offense, and the many Black and Latino and people of color who've had to spend time in jail for minor offenses in Rikers or in other city jails as well, right? And so this becomes a catalytic moment for him as well. And that, and that insofar as we're thinking about human rights or thinking about housing rights, that these rights are not just things that happen, should be executed simply where you are, but everywhere. They should exist everywhere. They should exist wherever place you are. And I think that that's something where we can talk about housing as a human right, as something that continues to be something that we fight for, not just nationally, not just locally, not just nationally, but also internationally. And I'm going to end my comments there. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Kazembe. That was amazing, honestly, and so thought-provoking. I mean, one thing, I know we've got a little time here now where perhaps some of the other panelists and myself might, ask you a couple of things, actually. And one thing that came to mind for me was I wanted to ask you about your thoughts on the impact of gentrification and on the arts. And one thing when you were talking that came to mind for me that I think some people maybe, a lot of people know, and some people maybe don't realize is, that Lincoln Center was an urban renewal project, right? And what was displaced from about 18 city blocks, was a very thriving and vibrant community of color, to then create what is now this sort of artistic and cultural sort of, somewhat upper class institution, right? And so I'm kind of interested in your thoughts around, and perhaps, using Harlem as an example, if that's what you're sort of more focused on, but just your thoughts around how gentrification impacts the artistic life of communities of color.
I mean, yeah, I mean, like we talking about, like Lincoln Center knocked down San Juan Hill, which was the home of Thelonious Monk. So like Monk's home gets knocked down, to place this, monstrosity of Lincoln Center. I mean, that's nothing to say of the artists who performed there. I'm sure they're great people, but like, I'm not a big fan of the architecture of Lincoln Center. That's just my own personal thing. But that's all to say that I think that, for me, I think that, you know, like, look, I mean, what made New York City attractive, was the communal life of Black, Jewish, and Latino people, and working class people who came to the city, and the expression of that. So one thing that I always think about is that, you know, Hedda Jones and Leroy Jones and aka Mary Baraka, um, their production of arts, the jazz scene that happened in the East Village, the magazines that came out, were a mix of, like, Jewish anarchism, socialist literature, and Black radicalism. In a multicultural vision, and a lot of that has been able to be defended because of smart policy decisions, like, for example, the Cooper Square Committee. And I want to raise the name of Francis Golden, who was a literary agent. And I think about the Fourth Avenue Arts Block as a community land trust, as a space where, like, you can actually hold spaces for, like, concerts and, like, and galleries and things of that nature. And so I think that, as we're kind of, like, thinking through this specific period, specifically now when, like, let's face it, many of the artists, many of the arts community, many many of the arts community is suffering right now. And we in America made a decision to privatize the arts And I think that we have to have a challenge to that. I didn't mention earlier, but my day job is I work for the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung New York office, and which is based out of headquarters out of Germany. And in Berlin, they had instant grants to artists. You fill out a grant on Tuesday, you got to fill out a grant on Thursday, you got a grant on Monday, and you cash in hand. So you continue to create art, because the arts was seen as something that's communal, that's something that's furthering to state craft, not just like entertainment or something that should be privatized. And so what I think that what we're challenged to do is to think through arts as a policy and as an administrative arm, and to do that work. And I'm interested to learn more about where that is happening, and where that fight is, because I think the artists are very interested around building around that as well. And many of the people who are fighting for housing right now are artists. So I think that's very important.
Thank you. I'm going to see if Sandra or Rob have any questions.
Just, I guess for me, a couple of comments. And I so appreciate being around Kazembe. And I'll say that for everybody on this panel, right? I'm not shy about saying I've been blessed to do this work through a series of relationships, and everybody in this discussion I've had great relationships with. But I also learn. I'm a newbie to organizing. I'm going to say that, even though you see all this gray hair, I'm new to organize. I started this work in 2006. I'm sorry, I ain't that new. To 2006, and I've been blessed to work with some incredible folks like all of you. But I think I'm Kazembe, you used the word challenge and holding space, and you mentioned the Fourth Avenue and the land trust of Cooper Square. I often am challenged around that, to say that it's such a big challenge for us right now because of the fact of the commodification of land and in New York, and how difficult that struggle is. But there's also, and I'm not going to say this wholesale, but there's a reluctance of people to acknowledge that that is a real struggle. And we have to understand the role that capitalism plays in our everyday lives. I think that's a big part of it. Because you look at the landscape of Manhattan, when you think air rights are for sale, then it's almost difficult to create land trusts in Manhattan. I'm not saying don't work at it, but it is, that work will drain you, man. Let's be real, right? Because that's pushing a rock up a hill, and not too many of us are able to do that. So I wanted to add in there, but I just, again, just listening to Kazembe and even you, Marika, to start off is just fantastic for me. So thank you both.
I wanted to jump in and sort of redirect a little bit to an aspect of James Baldwin's writing that's always really captivated me. Is he's amazing on sort of these macro analyses. But one thing that I really gotten from his writing is also the way in which he captures the pathos of it at the individual level, of what the impact of racism and how it makes individuals feel. And I wondered if you had any comment or any thoughts about that portrayal and how it might have evolved from the time that he wrote and what makes him so vital today. So with regard to racism, neighborhood racism, that kind of structural impact and how it affects the individual. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it makes perfect sense. I'll just state it beginning. And maybe this kind of hits on some of Rob's point too. It's like, I'm sitting here in Co-op City, world's largest housing cooperative, limited equity housing cooperative. Built with the intention of Robin Moses connecting to the highway. And at least in his imaginary, and I would say, the fact that we don't have a subway here, like, speaks to the fact that, you know, it was meant to keep certain people out, to put it mildly. But now that it's 95% Black and Latino, not having a subway here keeps certain people out of the city, or makes it very difficult for people to travel to the city. And that's something I have to deal with every single day. And so it's different, like, you know, when I grew up in Manhattan, and I can walk to the Museum of Natural History if I had a bad day, to now where it takes me a whole time. It takes a lot of planning to take my son down to Manhattan to enjoy culture. You know, and that's a subtle way of thinking about how the structures of racism, like, impacts your choices. Because, you know, because then a car is involved, then a bunch of stuff is involved in, like, the whole type question of transportation. And we know from the COVID-19 crisis, the people who are serving people in Manhattan are traveling further from Manhattan every time, and it's becoming a health risk. Right, those essential workers mostly are coming from the Bronx. So I think that what I always think about in terms of Baldwin's work, and I think this is very important, is that I define racism in three modes. It's economic exploitation, social exclusion, which is things like squashing down voting rights, and personal degradation. And they work in tandem with each other, right? And so this is where, like, the intersectional analysis comes in. You can't challenge one without challenging the other, because if you're talking about who's an essential worker, you have to talk about how they're portrayed in society and seen as other. And I think that Baldwin's work, I would love everybody to, like, you know, after the end of this panel, to take a look at the film Take This Hammer, which is a documentary that James Baldwin did in San Francisco. And in one of the scenes, one of the young people is talking to Baldwin, and he says, "I don't belong here. I'm not a citizen here. I'm not a citizen. I don't belong here." And that's a feeling that's really kind of pervasive, but it's also the feeling that we're challenged in this particular political time right now, when you have a far right that in 2016 was talking about building a wall, and now in 2020, you know, is showing up with anti-Blackness and talking about we need to squash the cities. And both build a wall and squash the cities are both connected to citizenship, and who has a right to be a citizen and who doesn't, right? And so this is the fulcrum of full participation, right? That's all it is. Who gets to be a citizen? You know, and I think everyone deserves to be a citizen. And I think that goes into some of the cosmopolitanism that Baldwin exudes stylistically, philosophically, you know, in all that way. And that's why we love him, and that's why I think a lot of kids grab him, because he understands that he said that, you know. And the last thing I'll say is that I'm not your Negro. I am a full citizen, and I define myself by the terms that I set. And my activism is engaging in my citizenship and stepping into these spaces in which people have told me I shouldn't step into. And I think that's the boldness that we need right now, because Baldwin was no punk. Excuse me, he suffered no fools. He suffered no fools. And he said the same thing to people in Harlem that he said to Robert F. Kennedy and Norman Mailer. And I think that's important. That's the same thing. That's the same energy we need to have today with our activism as well.
Thanks for that, Kazembe, and thank you, Sandra and Rob, for really sort of the thought-provoking comments and questions. I think we're gonna move to Rob now, and Rob, I think you're gonna talk to us a little bit, I believe, about your housing justice work here and internationally, and perhaps you can tell us a bit about what you've observed, particularly around the right to housing here in the US.
So thanks once again, and it's kind of hard to follow Kazembe, but so much respect. So it's an honor to speak up, to speak behind him, right? Because it just opens up this place of critical thinking, which I say is so important in our work as we engage today. So I think for me to start off, I want a couple of acknowledgments, and following in the footsteps of Kazembe, he acknowledged Cecil from We Act, who I also had a great relationship. You saw in the photo collage that Marika put out earlier, and you saw the photos of folks in the street. A lot of those folks were wearing orange shirts that represented a housing organization in the Bronx called CASA, and CASA Power, and a lot of CASA leaders were in there. But we lost a CASA leader late last year by the name of Carmen Vega Rivera. And I think it's real poignant that I'm going to talk about international work a little bit and international human rights, because Carmen, as she started to know me and we started to work together, I did a lot of volunteer and leadership development work with CASA. She was very interested in the international work that I joined, and then she traveled to Ecuador and Brazil with me. She went to Brazil with me twice, and Ecuador once, along with some other CASA members. So I just want to shout out to any CASA members that are listening out there, and you'll see their fist in the orange shirts, and they're always shouting out CASA power. So I know Sandra's heard those chants while we've been on the streets together, but I just wanted to make that quick acknowledgement. Then I think the second acknowledgement I want to make is when I first came into this work, and I just, in my comments briefly before, I talked about getting my start in organized. I started with Picture the Homeless. And one of the things, not only from Picture the Homeless staff and other folks, but other organizations, as I was involved in the Right to the City Alliance that formed here in the U.S., is I kept being told you can't work with academia and you can't work with lawyers. And I just want to give a shout out to Marika, Marika and I have done some public speaking engagements outside of New York. And I find myself acknowledging Marika, who I've known for probably about 10 years. I talk about movement lawyers and public interest lawyers. And I said this to some legal folks recently. When you look up that role in the dictionary, there's a picture of Marika. So I just wanted to make that acknowledgement, publicly. I try to acknowledge those folks who really pulled me into this work and supported the work that I was doing and the work of the groups that I was working with doing it. So shout out to you, Marika, for all you've done to support our work on the ground, the work that myself, Kazembe, and Sandra's, and all the coalitions that we're a part of and work with. So thank you very much for all you do. So, enough of thanking people. I know folks are like, okay, give me some stuff, Rob, right? So I've been blessed to do this work both locally, nationally, and internationally. And through those trials and moving, I will share some stories about working with different groups and how thinking has been shaped for me, particularly with respect to human rights, which I think is at the forefront of all of the work that I'm involved in now. We are in this quote unquote so-called democracy in the US. We call it a democracy, but I question that. I question 400 years of good old boy language that this constitution of this country is mired in. I might say we're somewhat representative democracy in certain places, but I don't think that's a true democracy. And I say that because I'm a believer in human rights. I think meeting people's human needs outweighs civil law, which this country bases itself on. So civil war speaks to some of those interests that we were talking about earlier, or Kazembe had mentioned, like the interests of the elites, right? It doesn't necessarily speak to those of us who were struggling in communities, those of us that are people of color that have lived a life of struggle, born into struggle, and continue to live through that struggle, right? I just don't think civil rights do that. So, and I always get a kick, especially, and I'm so happy that Marika is moderating this discussion, because I talk about visuals a lot in this work. And in our courts, when you talk about law, you see the scales of justice, where these scales are, supposed to be equal. But, I have a little different way of saying the scale. When I did the work of Take Back the Land, we would always say in our scales of justice, the human right to a home outweighs the right of a landlord or a speculator to profit off of a home. And that was always the basis for their work. How do you meet people's needs? And a lot of that meeting and understanding came through international human rights law, which we're kind of dismissive of in this country. So before I go into detail about that, I'm going to bring it back to the U.S. a little bit and frame this sort of in COVID. But I want to be very clear at the outset of my comments. The discussions that I'm going to engage in and the issues that I raise through what I say have long existed before COVID was even a problem in this country. COVID exacerbated the issues, but these issues already existed. So let's be clear about that up front. And I think Kazembe's presentation and Marika's opening comments about the historical context of struggle, especially around housing, alluded to that fact. So if we reverse, go back to March, as COVID was taking a hold and starting to spread across the U.S., the Center for Disease Control's issued some guidelines. And one of the things that the Center for Disease Control really made the statement that said shelter in place. And I started to think about what that means. I know what it means for somebody like me, who lived homeless once upon a time, who spent over 2 years on the streets of Miami and 10 months in a New York City homeless shelter. But what does that mean to the person that I see laying on the floor in the Fulton Street station in downtown Manhattan on a daily basis as I'm coming in to the Office of Partners for Dignity and Rights? And that sort of raised a flag for me, and it had me reaching out to some allies and folks that I work with on the West Coast, mainly in a coalition out there called WRAP, W-R-A-P, the Western Regional Advocacy Project. And they were thinking the same way. And we started to collectively think of tactics and strategies we could use to change the situation. How do we improve the lives of those folks, or how do we get shelter to those folks who were street homeless? We don't see it here as visible. Well, you're starting to see, I should take that back, the tent cities the way you do on the West Coast. They're very visible, but they're starting to pop up here. They manifest a little bit differently, but they are here. And so we started to have conversations, and we realized that there are all these vacant hotels, right? So why not move people who are street homeless into these vacant hotels and meet their needs and somewhat stabilize their lives? Because we have to, if this is something we all have to engage in, then we all should be a part of the solution. And we started agitating, and some of us have different levels of access to be able to engage politicians and government at different levels. Certainly my work, being formerly homeless and being involved in the New York City Coalition on the Continuum of Care, gave me access to New York City government at high levels, Department of Social Services at high levels, and even to Housing and Urban Development in DC. And we started a campaign of agitating and irritating until we got responses, clean across the country. We came out with strong messaging, and the government decided they're going to start to contract with these vacant hotels and move folks in. So that, just to sort of ground this in the era of COVID, that's some of the work that I've been involved in nationally. There's a lot of work that I've been involved in locally, but Sandra will do more talking about that, and we will interact as we get later on in this conference. But I want to take it overseas a little bit, and a lot of the work related to those hotels was connecting the international community to some of those tactics and strategies that we use here. I'm a firm believer in that. I've always been grounded in this human rights framing. That comes from working with, doing the work of Take Back the Land, when we were breaking in homeless houses that were vacated because people were foreclosed and evicted. after banks got our tax money in 2008 and saying we can solve the homeless problem, when in 2010, when there were 4.1 million vacant homes in this country and a little over 500,000 homeless people, the work of Take Back the Land, basically, we had a tagline that says, put homeless people in people's homes. So it was always a thinking of how do we better utilize space, right? And that's starting to think critically. These spaces are vacant. These houses are ours. Since our tax money supported the bank, you can't have, that tax money in the houses too. And it started an era of critical thinking for me and those in the Take Back the Land movement of how community can gain control of land and housing, particularly the Black community, which has always been excluded from these opportunities. And it was just systemically taking it back, right? And that's always been at the forefront. We thought way back then about community land trusts. We were arguing that these foreclosed homes should be put in community land trusts rather than the banks being able to profit off them again. And then we used international human rights laws, mechanisms, and standards to support those arguments, and opened up a whole new way of thinking, which for me personally gave me access to Brazil. Why Hunger here in New York? In 2013, I was asked to join a meeting with some folks in Brazil because they started hearing talks given by Take Back the Land at different universities in the U.S. And somebody from the movement of people affected by dams in Brazil was on a call with Salo Araujo here in New York, who worked for Why Hunger, and asked them if they knew of me, because this guy's always talking about changing the relationship to land. And Salo kind of laughed and put me on a Skype call with them right away. And the rest is history, as they say. I traveled to Brazil and started to study at the MST school, and understanding the Brazilian constitution, which says land has to serve a social function. It's a huge shift from the capitalist way and the commodification of land and housing here, right? Giving you an understanding. And if you take international human rights law and you say, well, we're going to meet people's needs, and you do that under a set of values and principles that we're not always used to, I think it starts to get people to think a little bit differently. The international community has always used international human rights law to respect a set of values and standards and how they govern. It's not readily accepted here, right? We've been dismissive of human rights, and we say, again, we stand under this umbrella of the supposed democracy, and we say, well, we don't need international human rights law. We're a democracy. Well, if we're a democracy, why was it at one time that our civil law said, because of the color of your skin, you can't urinate in this bathroom over here because it's for whites only? You have to find one that says coloreds only. And it may not be in this town, but I'm a human being, right? I have to urinate. So should I die trying to find a bathroom? It's problematic. This was law once upon a time in this country, right? So I would argue, again, it makes the argument for me, I'm really invested in human rights law versus civil rights law. Fast forward to 2014, when Detroit was going through a water crisis, city went bankrupt, the city of Flint, all documented crises around water. Emergency managers were put in place because both cities claimed they were bankrupt, stripping away the democracy and the representative democracy that the people voted on, and one person is making decisions about those cities. Well, I don't know. That doesn't work for me. Then you're going to put the problems of this bankrupt city on the backs of people in Detroit by saying you're 2 months behind in your water bill, or you're $150 in arrears. You're not going to get any. You need water to survive. So starting to think different, right? Human rights law has to come in to the work that we do. And a lot of that indoctrination was bringing the UN to Detroit to visit the problem, and having those voices. 2 UN rapporteurs in 2014 we brought to Detroit: Caterina de Albuquerque, the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Water and Sanitation, and Lani Farha had just become Housing Rapporteur, right? So we brought her right into the struggle. And I think understanding that our voices can be echoed by the UN and these UN mechanisms when our own governments aren't listening to us was powerful. But you watch this play out. and how these mechanisms are used around the rest of the world, and say we need to employ a similar set of strategies and tactics like some of these movements around the world. And when I say some of these movements, I particularly like to point at the shack dwellers movement in South Africa, right? Abishali, Basemonjondolo. We have a strong relationship with them here in this country. Some of us do, I should say, and have learned from them. But likewise, they always said to us, we've learned from the Take Back the Land movement. The way you all approach your work is something we can learn from. So with sharing those sets of strategies and tactics with movements around the world, Abishali was instrumental in pushing towards a constitution in post-apartheid South Africa. The new constitution, written in 1996, guarantees the human right to a home, but folks weren't actualizing it. So Abishali became a movement in around 2005 after some of the activists who were traveling to and from Durban to work in the center of the city but couldn't live there. They were forced out to the outskirts of the city. They would travel 2.5 hours a day to get to and from work and passing all this vacant land. Started claiming the land. They were self-determined, built shacks. The municipalities came in, and because land was still being commodified there, saying you didn't have title to the land and trying to force them off. But it engaged in struggle that got worldwide attention, got the support of social movements around the world, and we all collaborated and used the UN to shine a spotlight on the problems of Abishali and people being forced off land. I mentioned social movements in Brazil. I have strong ties to the movement of people affected by dams, also the MST. The MST, the Landless Workers Movement, is one of the biggest social movements in the world. We learned from them. The Landless Workers Movement started similar to Abishali, moving at night, because as I alluded to earlier, that Constitution says land has to serve a social function, a social purpose. The Landless Workers Movement understood that and collaborated and said, okay, if we move on these lands at night and we move in and we start to grow food, it's serving a social function. We're self-determined. We can take bamboo that's plentiful. When daylight comes, we start to build homes, right? Before you know it, you build community. More people come, that community expands, and then somebody takes the plants that were grown to heal the sick. Healthcare problems seem to go away. When I go to work, Kazembe's family watches my children. When Kazembe goes to work, I watch their children. Childcare issues go away. Before you know it, land seems to change. Access to land seems to change social society. So, it's learning from these movements, learning from the movement of people affected by mortgages in Spain, the platform, and who use a right to the city platform and international human rights standards to push back on banks that are commodifying land and housing there. And I think having those voices echo within the UN mechanisms, former UN Rapporteur Leilani Farha issued a report on corporate landlords in 2018 and particularly pointed a finger at Blackstone, which is the largest housing owner in the world, and spoke out to our government, a strongly worded letter by her and several other rapporteurs that said the financialization of housing is destroying people's lives and denying them the right to a home. So I think it's incumbent upon us to understand these international human rights laws, standards, and mechanisms. And then I'll just speak to a process that's coming up very soon with some closing comments. So in 2010, I was blessed to travel to Geneva, Switzerland, with several organizations, mainly the U.S. Human Rights Network. There was the support of Columbia University's Human Rights Institute and the University of Miami Law School's Human Rights Institute, and be supported by these folks who basically, it was the U.S.'s first appearance before something called the Universal Periodic Review. It is a review of human rights violations within a specific country, and every country that is a part of the UN goes through this process every 5 years. On November 9th of this year, in the afternoon, the U.S. is set to go before that board again. So a lot of my work the last few weeks have been speaking to missions online. We just spoke last week to 44 missions of the European Union, to speak about structural racism in the UN, the lack of access to housing, violations of the human right to housing, human right to water, human right to sanitation, the human right to not allow people to do sex work. All of these things came into a factor. It is up to us now to really push missions to question the U.S. in a strong way. And these are processes I learned from 2010, going to Geneva and having one-on-ones. It's a little bit different now when you have to do this work online. Not so sure of the impact that it has, but we do think it can be effective. And, we're doing targeted outreach to those missions interested in specific issues within the U.S. And we do this because at the end, the U.S. government has to respond to those issues that were raised and those points that were addressed within that human rights body. And it gives us a tool for on-the-ground organizing to really shift the narratives and make social change on the ground. So I'll close out my comments with this. I don't think you can make social change without direct action or civil disobedience being at the forefront. And it was great to see the collage of photographs going across and people, even in this time of COVID, coming out into the streets. So a blessing to Black Lives Matter, who saw the killing of George Floyd and said, we're going to rise up. Thank you to all the young white allies that supported those social movements, because I think that's so important. Those on the street protests look a lot different than the protests that I was involved in between 2005 and let's say just after Occupy 2012. I think there is a big shift, and Kazembe alluded to that earlier. There is a change undergoing, but it's not a change that's going to happen overnight. It's going to take continual work. It's going to take people organizing, and it's going to take continual collaboration between people whose interests might seemingly be different. And when I say that, I mean grassroots organizing, community activists, academia who brings the theory, and the legal folks who are engaged in the policy. We wouldn't have gotten the right to counsel without all of those forces collaborating together. So, I just want to thank you for the time. Again, thank you to Community Service Society and all the folks behind the scenes that, brought us together to have this conversation.
Thank you, Rob. I'm going to turn, we're running a little behind schedule, but not too badly. And I think we do have time, Sandra or Kazembe, if either of you or both of you have a question you want to put to Rob, or something you want to comment on that caught your attention.
Well, Rob brings up so many points. I'll jump in because he really takes us across a panoramic, truly international understanding of these issue of housing and right to housing. So it's hard to pinpoint. But what I wanted to talk about a little bit was this idea. Why do you think, beyond the difference between civil rights or civil law-based approach and human, what is it that makes the U.S. and all of us, why is the idea of the right to housing so difficult for us to understand? What, if you could pinpoint?
So I think it's a set of values and principles fundamentally, Sandra, right? So early on in my human rights education, I was taught about an easy way to remember that. So we used the word taupe, which is the color beige, T-A-U-P-E. T for transparency, A for accountability, U for universality. It should work for all of us, whether I'm documented or undocumented. P for participation. We have the right to participate in those decisions that are going to affect our lives. And E, it should bring equity for all of us. Fundamentally, you would think a democracy would adhere to that set of values and principles. But when the democracy is based on a capitalist system, that ain't happening, right? So I think there are a couple of things that come into this, right? We have to think of when you're exploiting labor economic, exploitation, as Kazembe put it, I think it's hard. When you socially exclude people, it's problematic, right? And when you personally degrade people, you can't adhere to that set of principles. So how do we push? But I think it's also a set of narratives that we believe in. So sometimes we as people absorb those narratives. And I'll give you the argument that I use that brought me into social justice work. As somebody who went through homelessness and somebody who had a lived experience, when I quote unquote got my life together, as they like to phrase it, right? I kept hearing this narrative. You're homeless because you don't want to work. You're homeless because you don't have an education. You're homeless because you have a chemical or an alcohol addiction. You're homeless because you have mental illness. Well, I was like, that's a lot of bullshit. I went homeless after working 35 years. I have an education. I have a degree from the University of Maryland. Never diagnosed with a chemical addiction or an alcohol addiction. But, the narrative is if you're homeless, you fit under that umbrella. So I think the same is true when you think about housing. It's the way to wealth. And you've heard this argument from me. It's the way to perpetual debt, but we still absorb that narrative. Years ago, it might have worked, but conditions change over a period of time, right? And it's interesting that Kazembe brings up Co-op City because conditions have changed from there, but those conditions changed because the people forced to change. There was a rent strike back in the early 60s at Co-op City that really changed the way people think, or at least to some level. But those changes haven't spread across the landscape. I think we're still affected as people on the ground by those narratives and believing in stories that are put before us. Until we can shed that, that's our biggest problem in my assessment, right? So for me, again, I'll go back to a transformation in life. That period of time of spending 2 years on the streets of Miami and 10 months in the New York City homeless shelter. When I came out, brain dump, what I went through and what I'm living through now, and looking back on my family's life, I ain't buying the narratives. I gotta, something has to change. So education, political education, popular and political, all of those things need to be constant at the root of the work you and I both do with organizing, right? So thank you.
Rob, Kazembe here, and I just want to say, I want to echo Sandra's point that I'm so happy to be in community and comradeship and the brilliance that you bring to the table in terms of your international perspectives and thinking broadly, but bringing it down locally. And I guess this is where my question lies, because I think that, we've been in spaces together where like the challenge has always been around provincialism. So a lot of neighborhood organizing and housing organizing has been about my block, my neighborhood, my hood. And, and there's a wall constructed around that. And so you brought up the hotels, and obviously there was a whole entire fight this summer around hotels in New York City and housing for COVID. I'm wondering, in your experience or internationally or locally, how do we break through some of the NIMBYisms around organizing, and how do we break through some of the provincialisms around organizing, particularly in the much tougher communities that may not be as receptive, or how do we transform that? And I would love to hear your thoughts on some of that stuff.
Yeah, thank you, Kaz. I think that's the struggle for us right now, right? Again, how you enter this work, I think, plays on it. For me, I had an unusual entry point, being supported by all of you. Not everybody is that blessed. Not everybody's that blessed to have a relationship with Why Hunger, who puts you on a plane and sends you to Brazil and says, go study with the MST. But what I did learn from that international work was the power of political education. And I start with fundamentally, I think, I have some criticisms of the way we organize here in the U.S. We use the Olinsky style of organizing, and I think one of the things that sort of eats at me a little bit is when they say meet people where they're at. Well, honestly, if I pose this question to you and say, make this statement, does it make you think different? people are all over the place. How can we be successful? If you're going to meet people where they're at, well, Sandra's here, Rob is over here, Marika's over here, Kaz is over here, right? But in Brazil, what I learned from my time down there is they use the word formação, which is Portuguese for formation. Let's do the political education to bring everybody to one place, and then we move together in formation. And I think just changing our strategies and tactics on the way we organize can support that work. But I also believe that we lack ongoing political education here, Kaz, and the work that we do as organizers, and this is not a knock at Sandra or anybody else. I think internationally they organize because they have to, not because it's my job, right? I think you look at it a little bit differently when it's my job. When it's my job, I have to do what the organization tells me to do. When I get money as an organization from a philanthropic organization, I have a certain set of goals, standards, and objectives I got to meet based on the way the foundation dished out that money. So it changes the way you can approach the work, and maybe, again, and I often talk about this and people scratch their heads when I say it, maybe I've been blessed to be able to do this work from a privileged point of view. I don't rely on a salary from a not-for-profit organization. So when Sandra says, Rob, I need you to support this movement, or, you have relationships to the press, I'm going to reach out on behalf of Goddard Riverside and say, this is my contribution to the work. That's my comrade. I gotta look out for Sandra and Goddard Riverside because they're doing the kind of work I want to do. But not everybody can work that way. So I think fundamentally, Kaz, changing the way we approach organizing, right, to sort of move away from that meet people where they're at, because I don't know how much we can make change working in that way. And I think understanding that if you include a set of values and principles in that work, your approach might change fundamentally and almost automatically, right? Like, do we have the right? How many, people were talking about participatory democracy a couple of years ago, but those things fade away somewhat, right? It was at the forefront because it was popular outside of the US and it got introduced here. But we tend to, it's not this sexy thing right now, right? An organizer, right? So we've moved on to something else. No, until it's rooted, we have to stick with it. And change doesn't come overnight. So having that understanding, but that's all, again, part of political education. Long-winded answer, I know, but, again, I'm able to sit on the periphery and really critically think about the way we all approach this work.
Thanks, Rob, and thank you, everyone. I mean, I think when we're asking the tough questions, there's very rarely a short answer. So thank you for that. It's actually a great segue, honestly, to Sandra, who, as you said, is a tenant organizer, and Sandra, you're in your work, obviously working alongside tenants of color in working class neighborhoods every day, neighborhoods that are gentrifying, and so I'm hoping you can share a little bit with us what your work looks like right now and how the right to housing and the right to the city fit in with the work that you're doing.
Thank you. Yeah, it's really, I was going to say, it's pretty hard to follow Kazembe, you also, Marika, laying out this huge cultural and historical context, and Rob, obviously. So I have to say I'm a little bit nervous, but I'll try to do the best I can. So I'll talk a little bit about, I won't so much talk about the right to the city because I see that as sort of a little bit more of like an academic discourse. But I did want to talk about the right to housing and how even in just 2 short years of being a tenant organizer in working class neighborhoods, working primarily with people of color, the right to housing is something that I've seen come into people's everyday understanding of their reality, right? So there's a way in which people now see housing as part of health. And I think that, for lack of a better way to put it, when I was training in my training, I'm very recently arrived at this profession, being a community organizer, major in social work. It was clear to me in my field placements that outside of access to regular health, and that was pretty much, we have a safety net. It's not a great system, but we do have a safety net. We really had lost a safety net, or never had a good one for housing. So that to me became the crisis, an area that about human well-being, societal well-being, the issues of social exclusion, and obviously structural racism. So the perpetuation of hundreds of years of oppression through housing. So that was a compelling need I saw and also I wanted to see how did communities of color who have collectively been anchoring neighborhoods in New York City. I was born in the South Bronx, got burnt out in the 70s from a couple of apartments, and my parents decided to move to a mill town in New England, to pursue their version of the American dream. That's an interesting side note. But, as soon as I was 18, I came back to live in New York City, and I've lived in Harlem pretty much for the most of my life. So the last 30 years. So this feels like home, and it feels like home because it has people like me in it. It's multicultural, it's multiracial, it's, there's always been, it has people that are lesbian, gay, transgendered, etc. Harlem is a place where you might get heckled for being flamboyant, or you might be lifted up by your neighbor. So this is a very special place, and I'm honored to live here. But to go back, so I wanted to understand, how is it that when people are suffering hundreds of years of oppression, they can still create something so vibrant, something so important, something that is legendary, that people come to see and come to be a part of, right? Like there's that quote from Ralph Ellison. He goes, for African Americans of a certain age, going to Harlem is like, going to Paris. So since Baldwin was from Harlem, he had to go to Paris. But the imaginary, right, of what is the thing that is legendary to you? And what we talked about a little bit is that it's something about the social connections. And that's where tenant organizing, why I think tenant organizing and grassroots movements are so uplifting, right? I mean, the neighbors start by having common concerns, common worries, doing mutual aid. And we see that in COVID a lot. As a tenant organizer, we hear a lot about, people offering to get groceries for their elder neighbors so they wouldn't have to go stand in lines at supermarkets. People teaching their elders how to use technology so that they can connect to church services, participate in tenant association meetings via Zoom, or get in touch with family that lives out of state. So that strain of mutual aid is definitely a part of what makes our neighborhoods and communities of color be resilient. There's a famous epidemiologist / sociologist, Mindy Fulilove, talks about root shock. She has a book, it's about tearing up of city neighborhoods. And she talks about how displacement tears apart these social networks, and what the negative consequences of that have been over the last 40, 50. I mean, when we left the South Bronx, it meant we lost our Puerto Rican caretakers, right? They were the old folks who took care of me when I was a toddler. And then over time, every building next to them just kept getting demolished until the last time I ever saw them, they were in 2 buildings, and the rest was just a charnel house of, demolished brick. And so nothing, so to me, how did we go from that, from like 1978, 1979, South Bronx, to this amazing city, which has just been through this incredibly traumatic public health emergency? And how do we, there's no particular way to quantify. I mean, we could say neighbors helping neighbors. We can talk about and talk about organizing. And I do think I will talk about organizing a little bit more. But I also wanted to talk about health. And that's what made me think about Full of Love is one of the big things that has sort of interested me in about the right to housing and how I've arrived at deciding that the entire civil law framework is oppressive and to be tossed out. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, so I may look like one or play one on television, but it doesn't matter to me. I don't get in trouble for saying that. I'm an organizer and I'm a social worker, right? And there's parts of the code of ethics and social work that talk about social justice. They talk about self-determination. They talk about service, among other things. And we are not serving our communities well when we constantly uplift property rights and the right to profit off off the oppression of others, right? And in this country, that's tended to be, but not exclusively. I mean, poor whites get it just as bad living in they get it profit motive living in a trailer park in Wisconsin as folks who live in neglected, underfunded public housing or rent stabilized apartments that have not been taken care of. But so the health issue, that it comes a little bit as an international framework around, it has to do with the UN and it has to do with the World Health Organization. And I know a lot of folks in the US don't really regard those organizations with the same, sort of, we don't revere them. And I think that's fine. But there's always a reason why people get attracted to some of those frameworks, because I think primarily because the ones here are so disempowering, right? Everything comes down to elite corporations being able to do whatever they want. And so we look to some kind of standard of justice, international law, or just a set of standards about what it means to be human and what it means to have responsibilities to one another. So evictions are violent. Homelessness is real, and we see it with our eyes. It's a moral outrage, and we should, when we watch, those are not failures of individual, of the individual. They are really societal failures. Every eviction is a stain on our values as a society and how we are not able to find frameworks that meet the moment. The frameworks that we're working with are so old. Civil law, Anglo-American legal tradition is a term I remember Jeff Sessions using. Our current Attorney General uses says seeing a remarkable onslaught against property rights. What he means is people are fighting for their human rights, and he doesn't like it. So, what am I seeing on the ground? To turn back, we see the same strategies for coping and living that we've seen, for ages. We have multi-generational families that are doubling up or tripling up because they have to take on the responsibilities that our state and or corporate social responsibility pablum cannot actually deal with this stuff. So affordable housing crisis, or it's beyond a crisis. It's it's a complete abnegation of responsibility toward our fellow humans. As Marika said at the top, we have enough housing. It's basically one of these false scarcity narratives that are also used to depress workers' wages, right? And to make it that people will work to live and live to work. It doesn't have to be that way. I was thinking about, I was listening to these folks, so many different comments, but I recall one time Michael Bloomberg saying, nobody has a right to live in New York City. And it's something that I have found extremely galling ever since. because what he's saying is nobody, if market forces will that you need to be moved so that I can build something, or somebody, or somebody who contributes to my campaign can build something, then you don't have a right to remain. I mean, this comes from a very, a lot of not progressive types regard Bloomberg as a successful mayor, but I think that comment alone, to me, disqualifies him for any kind of, like, I don't know. I just found it so galling. And he also was a person who wouldn't sign a living wage bill. So this is just a very recent this is the recent kind of pressures that New Yorkers struggle under. So the other thing you see also in sort of the current environment is that, folks who have larger apartments will sometimes rent a room to, it used to be like a single man or, a single woman, but nowadays you're actually seeing people renting an entire room to an entire family. I've been in SROs where you'll have a family of like 5 living in a tiny room. Even prior to COVID, these types of living conditions were detrimental to physical and mental health outcomes. We've seen along the lines of neighborhoods that have been identified as rapidly gentrifying or subject to displacement pressure. You see that folks who've had to move because of, their grandmother died and they weren't able to succeed to the lease of that apartment where they've been living. So now they're homeless, essentially, through no fault of their own. They are more likely, I think it was a public health study done by the New York City Mental Health and Hygiene Department, folks like who have to move like that end up being hospitalized, usually in public hospitals, at great expense, much more, usually for mental health or substance issues. So those, it's very disturbing. I mean, that's a very big collateral consequence of our failure to provide safe, dignified, and secure. And by secure, I mean housing that you don't have to worry about. That's basically your housing in perpetuity. There's such a need for it. So I think about the right to housing, the more I talk with folks who've been through these struggles for decades and say to them, sort of like, it's kind of like a political education question, like, what do you think needs to change? Or what do you think is happening, that's different from the 70s, the 80s, or the 90s, when there was more white flight and, nobody, quote unquote, wanted your neighborhood. Because that's what they always say to me. When nobody wanted this neighborhood, my neighbors, myself, we made this neighborhood. And they're not wrong, right? They were the small business owners. They had the mutual aid societies. They had the sweat equity that Marika alluded to. They took buildings that had been abandoned and they made him into homes, right? So as we develop a more sophisticated human rights vocabulary in this country around housing, I think we're going to see that corporate interests they're running scared. Cancel rent terrifies them. They know that it's maybe cancel rent is not the term that's going to win the campaign, the ultimate campaign to the right to housing, but it terrifies landlords and banks and all the financial interests, because they know that there is a clear moral need for our society to enshrine a right to housing and to, do as much as we can, even if that means taking away private property from somebody or some aspect of it, in order to, for the societal well-being. So we're talking about the other thing that I may have mentioned already is the increase in fatal opioid deaths is another concrete well-studied public health problem that arises from gentrification and from displacement pressure. And again, these are the multiple hospitalizations, the deaths, all these collateral consequences add up, and there is actually a financial toll to it. So the profit motive on one side undercuts the financial well-being of the state, where it's another form of corporate welfare, right? We're subsidizing investors' sort of gluttony over on the one side, and we're carving, we're taking from different pots of money that could be increasing societal well-being, better education, better physical environment, because those are all part of the World Health Organization's social determinants of health. And what I was going to say a little bit about the whole right to housing and the vocabulary, it goes a little bit along with like other movements, right? Popular movements. I had a quote here. Popular movements tug the conscience and change the status quo. And it is in these neglected spaces that radical power lies. That's from Rebecca Solnit, who does a lot of sort of commentary on various different movements, including climate change. So I think the housing as a human right movement that COVID and the eviction moratorium across the country have, anyway, they what was I going to say? They have crystallized that we need to move forward in the evolution of our understanding of these questions. So, and I'll leave with one last quote, that any human power can be resisted and changed by human beings. And that's where grassroots movements like tenant organizing come into play. I'll stop there because I ran over my allotted time. So.
Thanks, Sandra. That's great. We are a little running behind, and I'm wondering whether it makes sense now for us to move to audience questions, honestly, and comments. I'm hoping my fellow panelists won't mind if we do that first, and then if we do have time for Rob or Kazembe, for any of us to ask questions to Sandra, then we can do that. So I don't know if there are any questions.
I'll just jump in real quick.
Yes,
I really
please.
appreciate that, Sandra. That was beautiful. I love this statement that you made in regards to what it means to be human. And homelessness is real. Eviction is violent. Rob has done a lot of work around eviction defense and a lot of anti-eviction work. And then I love the historical framework of your own personal story with that of the neighborhoods that you inhabited. And I think that, in this particular historical period of reckoning, we've talked a lot about reparations and, and like historical looking back. And I'm wondering, in your framework, like, what does repair look like, in terms of communities that have suffered, and like, how do you see ideas of repair in regards to some of the violence that's occurred? And I don't know if we want to I don't know if you want to piggyback on this question, Rob, since we don't have too much time. Do you have a question as well?
I'm going to stay back. Hopefully we have audience questions. I do have a couple of comments, but I can reserve them. It's just great to hear Sandra. I don't know if we work on the streets together a lot, and to hear her perspective sitting in this space it's quite cool. So, it was great to hear her thoughts.
Oh, thank you, thank you both. Yeah, what would repair look like? I think repair looks like saying, I see you and I see your struggles and I see what you've given this city and you own it, not some bank, somewhere, or like a sovereign wealth fund. It looks like giving people a chance, almost like, I don't want to say any particular solution like community land trust or co-ops, because somebody out there will say, oh, but this is the caveat, or these are the downfalls or pitfalls. But let's just create a narrative that the people who live in the place own the place. How about, I think it would start with that. Something simple.
Thank you. So I think we're ready for the first questions or comments from the audience. Okay, and we have them appearing on our screen right now. And Mo Beasley has commented a lot earlier, actually, in this session, commented on the question of US democracy and whether it really is a democracy or just a wannabe democracy or an oligarchy with a pseudo democracy beard. And is there anyone in the panel who wanted to weigh in on that assessment?
Just, Marika, I'll speak to it quickly. I want to get in as many questions as we can. I spoke about this earlier. I have my doubts about it, from lived experience. I articulated those doubts. I think at best we can say we're a representative democracy, right? Because, our votes don't necessarily count, right? Just from the Electoral College, right? So it just explains that there's problems with the system, and I've questioned it with those concrete statements that I made earlier, right? Like, you have a constitution that's 400 years old. I really doubt that it's a true democracy.
And did anyone else want to weigh in on this, or if not, we can move to the next question. Okay, then is there another question or comment from the audience? Oh, we have here a question from Deepa Singh, which is for you, Rob, actually. And Deepa's asking us, particularly you, Rob, do you come across any struggles working with the UN, considering the relationship that has been established between the UN and this administration?
So I don't think fundamentally we run into struggles, but I'm going to agree with Sandra that, I'm realistic, right? The UN as a whole doesn't work for us, but I do know those mechanisms that can support the work that we do on the ground, right? So that's out of the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights. So UN rapporteurs, UN working groups on different issues. Right now, we're in the decade of people of African descent. So that UN working group is particularly focused between now and 2024 on struggles of African Americans. And that's how we agitated as the U.S. Human Rights Network to get a hearing on structural racism in the United States. Now, just to give Deepa an idea of some of the challenges you face, as we got 664 worldwide organizations to sign on and say, yeah, there should be a hearing on structural racism, the UN pushed back on the African states, which have a lot of power within the UN, to say, if you push forward on this, we're going to defund you. So we know what we're up against, and we've been able to navigate that in a way. So understanding, if you have a good understanding of this institution, how it works, how it doesn't work, you're able to get around some of those pitfalls.
Other audience questions or comments? Oh, I see here that Browne Drillett has commented and is sort of asking, piggybacking a little bit on what Mo was raising earlier. That isn't it really a class society?
Yeah, I'll take that one on. I mean, I agree. I mean, I think that we are living. What we're facing right now is the stratification of wealth in the society. And you can see this throughout the whole entire pandemic, where people like corporations like Target, Amazon, various different stores are making billions and billions and billions of dollars. And not only are they making billions and billions of dollars, they're reshaping the ways in which we live in the city. Across the street from me is a fast food restaurant, and you have like day and night Uber drivers coming in and out of their fast food restaurant, making Uber deliveries all throughout the night, all throughout the day. So what does that do in terms of shifting, the narrative around labor, and transportation and the right to the city and all these different ways of participating in the city? So I think that, in the fight right now, I think is like we have to connect issues of housing to issues of labor. We can't have, I think we have a housing movement that has to be coinciding with a stronger labor movement that kind of builds in, better working conditions, fair wages, and also undercuts the ability of these monopolies to determine laws. And let's call it what it is. You're not an independent contractor. You're a worker. You produce your labor produces wealth for these corporations, and so you should be fully protected under workers' rights, right? And not allowing corporations to define that.
Sandra or Rob, did either of you want to jump on that one?
I'd just follow up with that quickly by saying I think Kazembe is absolutely right, but that goes back to this question of political education. I don't think our society understands that as a whole. If they did, then people would be striking. When people strike, says rise up and let's not support those, right? We'd all keep our money in our pockets, right? We understand mutual aid. Sandra laid it out very clearly, right? We know how to take care of one another. So, we should be giving the middle finger to those organizations that say, you have to buy from us and I'm going to exploit labor while I deliver your meal. No, we're not going to live in a society like that. We're going to keep our money in our pockets. So I think it's the political education piece that I keep alluding to that's missing. How do we educate the masses on these issues is a fundamental question.
We, at least I can say for myself, we grew up in an era of that had a really disempowering, right? We saw disinvestment of the public sector and an emphasis on individual, right? The rugged individual of the early 20th century came back at the end of the 20th century and has never really left us, right? So it's people still refer to Amazon, which is a behemoth and employs tens of thousands of people, as Jeff Bezos's company, which is absurd. So when people think like that, they say, well, why am I not a Kardashian? Why don't I have a multi-billion-dollar fashion? And so it's political education, right? And talking about our history of communal struggle and not the narrative that we've been fed since the Reagan era, the Thatcher Reagan era, and, that continues on even through this ridiculous presidential administration we're living through right now.
Yeah, and it's so, I totally agree with you, Sandra, and it's so evident. You probably have encountered this as well. Like when we talk to people about the cancel rent bill, for example, a lot of tenants struggle with the idea that they should not be held accountable for the economic consequences of this crisis, right? And it's actually kind of honestly a wonderful moment to have the conversation.
Well, thank you guys so much. Is there any other questions? I'm sorry.
Kazembe, I'm not sure if you're hearing us. I think we have a technical glitch happening where Kazembe has maybe got a bit of a delay. But with tenants, a lot of folks, they feel the weight of that obligation to pay rent. And when they hear, actually, it's not your fault that you can't pay rent, and it's your landlord that needs welfare right now. They made an investment and they thought they were going to get a return on that investment, and that's not coming because of COVID. They should be the ones going cap in hand applying for welfare, not you. What you need is a political solution to, economic devastation of a pandemic. It's an amazing moment, honestly, where folks become very politicized around that question and are able to shed the weight of some of that sort of, I guess, what it is, indoctrination, of that belief that we should be paying our landlord money for something that they are not doing anything to merit, right?
It's absorbing those narratives, right? How do we rid ourselves of those narratives and say, wait a minute, right? That's the moment. Yeah. That's the moment that you talk about,
Yeah. And so I'm mindful of time, and I think this is a moment where we probably do need to close out, and so I want to thank and acknowledge each of you, Kazembe, Rob, Sandra, for your contributions today, but also your work that you're always doing, and for being in this struggle lifelong. And I want to thank everyone who joined us for the panel here today. And then finally, obviously, to particularly thank CSS for putting together such an amazing conference and for inviting us to be a part of it. I hope that all of you all will stick around for the 2 p.m. The 12 p.m. panel, or sorry, I'm getting the time wrong, but the next panel, the Labour Movement panel at 2 p.m. which has an amazing lineup as well. And I think, I'm really looking forward to it. And there's a lot more. So please look on the website, look at the program, and stick around, because there's so much to learn, and so much to talk about. So thank you all, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, Marika. My movement
Thank you,
lawyer.
Marika.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.